So way back in the past, like, say the 50s or something, some guy named Joseph Campbell makes this thing called the Hero's Journey, which is this kick-ass formula that explains how all kick-ass screenplays work. It, like, analyzed myths or something, but it made this basic formula of, like, a guy leaves house and fights his dad and, like, sleeps with his mom or something. Anyway, later this guy named George Lucas uncovers it in the 70s, back when he's, like, this hippie filmmaker smoking weed, you know, doing all those things hippie filmmakers do, and he incorporates it into this little movie that no one believes in, called Star Wars. That's right. Joseph fucking Campbell wrote Luke Skywalker, and if you want to get your screenplay sold, you gotta follow his formula too, because that's how Professor Campbell told us to write screenplays, right? It's how you write screenplays, right? It's the way. It's the way. It's how you write screenplays, right? Right? Or at least that seems to be how Campbell's usually talked about in modern film discourse. It's not exactly wrong per se, but much like the work that Campbell was studying, it's a work of modern Hollywood myth-making. Joseph John Campbell was born in 1904, and while studying at Dartmouth, found he didn't really enjoy biology or math that much, so ended up transferring to Cambridge to study medieval literature. Man after my own heart. He was pretty well traveled, having spent considerable time in India and Japan, and had a much broader range of interests than other people in his field at the time. While teaching as a professor of literature, Campbell became interested in the emerging field of comparative mythology. C. Scott Littleton, dude who spent time researching King Arthur and UFOs at my alma mater, defined comparative mythology as the systemic comparison of myths and mythic themes drawn from a wide variety of cultures. Basically the study of looking at two different myths from different cultural groups and holding them up next to each other and drawing conclusions from the interplay between the two of them. You're not necessarily comparing and contrasting them, but holding them up and finding interesting insights you can draw because of the relationship between them. Campbell believes that if you looked at all the great myths throughout history, you could find the similarities between them and then use that to reconstruct a kind of primordial origin myth, which he called the monomyth, or the hero's journey. Monomyth was a term that he borrowed from his friend James Joyce's book Finnegan's Wake, and he was also greatly influenced by Jungian psychology. Both Campbell and Jung were super influenced by this guy named Adolf Bestin, who pioneered a concept called the psychic unity of mankind. Those of you a bit more in the know of Jungian psychology might recognize this as the collective unconscious, with its archetypes and instincts and all that. Campbell believed that describing this primordial monomyth would uncover some kind of hidden basic truth about humanity, and thus help us understand ourselves at a more basic instinctual level. This 100% would not fly in a classroom, but the paragraph on Wikipedia about this is actually really good, so let me just quote that for a sec. As a strong believer in the psychic unity of mankind and its poetic expression through mythology, Campbell made use of the concept to express the idea that the whole of the human race can be seen as engaged in an effort of making the world transparent to transcendence, by showing that underneath the world of phenomena lies an eternal source which is constantly pouring its energies into the world of time, suffering, and ultimately, death. To achieve this task, one needs to speak about things that existed before and beyond worlds, a seemingly impossible task, the solution to which lies in the metaphors found in myths. These metaphors are statements that point beyond themselves, into the transcendent. The hero's journey was the story of a man or woman who, through great suffering, reached an experience of the eternal source and returned with gifts powerful enough to set their society free. And so there we go. Campbell wasn't particularly interested in film or modern narrative or helping you write a screenplay. He was more interested in comparing myths from different cultures and trying to find some essential truth about humanity in that search. Campbell first published his theory in 1949 in a book titled The Hero with 1,000 Faces. This book went on to become an early popular text in structuralism, which aimed to understand human society as a system of networks and structures that could be understood. And you can see how a rigid, almost mathematical formula underlying the collective unconsciousness of all myths would be very appealing to a movement that was all about interrogating structures. So what about these universal unconsciousnesses that Campbell found? Well, to put it simply, he thought that a lot of us were dealing with father issues and having to get pushed outside our comfort zone to become a man. Campbell himself described it as, "A hero ventures forth from a world of common day into a region of supernatural wonder. Fabulous forces are encountered, and a divisive victory is won. The hero comes back from a mysterious adventure with the power to bestow boons on his fellow man." Throughout Hero, Campbell outlines 17 beats that he thinks most stories move through that outlines the monomyth. Now, you may notice some things about these supposedly universal beats. Mostly that they're a total sausage fest. Or more specifically, the monomyth is told from an assumed male point of view. Campbell doesn't even seem to consider the option that the universal myth might not be the story of a boy becoming a man. Even though obviously that's a story that's not relatable to the majority of humanity statistically, Campbell still assumes patriarchally that this must be the way that all myths operate, just because of the human collective unconscious. There's quite a bit of good academic work criticizing Campbell, particularly through a feminist lens, as I've been doing here, since that's kind of the most obvious critique. But let's move away for the purpose of our discussion from the ivory tower of academia to Hollywood. Well, the good folks of academia were busy picking apart Campbell's book as problematic. Artists like Jim Morrison, Bob Dylan, and of course George Lucas were incorporating into their own work ravenously. Lucas would often talk about how Hero with a Thousand Faces influenced his writing of Star Wars, and the two often became intertwined in the public consciousness. Following the release of the original Star Wars in 1997, editions of Hero with a Thousand Faces began being printed with Luke Skywalker on the cover. In the mind of the film-going public, Campbell was the philosophical force that created Luke Skywalker. And as other filmmakers started catching wind of the story, they started incorporating Campbell's mythic stature into the origin story of their own films. Sometime in the early 90s, development executive Christopher Vogler wrote a memo to Disney outlining how to incorporate the beats of Hero into their screenplays. The memo went on to be key in the writing of Aladdin, The Lion King, and Beauty and the Beast. Following this success, Vogler developed the memo into a full-on screenwriting textbook that's still popular to this day called The Writer's Journey, Mythic Structure for Writers, using Campbell's text as an outline for how to write screenplays. The book ended up being super influential in how stories get written and pitched in Hollywood, and basically is the reason we think of Campbell the way we do today. So, there you go. That's how we get from Joseph Campbell, universal truth uncoverer of humanity, to Joseph Campbell, guy who knows how to structure your screenplay. I feel like in modern discourse about Campbell, we often lose sight of the fact that his theory is a work of comparative mythology, attempting to analyze an existent ancient text. It's interesting that in the latter half of the 20th century, Campbell himself went through a kind of mythologization, where he became a larger-than-life heroic figure himself, a Albert Einstein of narrative structure who deduced the formula of Luke Skywalker before anyone else. And if that's the story you need to go with to write your screenplay, that's fine, but people have been becoming increasingly incredulous to the idea of universal truths. Campbell and other structuralists were trying to reverse engineer a set of primordial truths about the human condition. They were trying to find some knowledge so ancient and basic that understanding it would allow us to transcend our current understanding of humanity. But now we know that those truths probably aren't real. Like the works that Campbell was studying, they're myths that were created to make us feel better and useful, to give us structure. Nowadays, academia has moved on to a theory called post-structuralism, which recognizes the systems structuralists identified as real and important, but also emphasizes them as artificial and man-made rather than natural and God-given. So for instance, we might say that the stories Campbell analyzed tend to have paternal themes because the societies he studied were largely patriarchal, instead of this being an expression of mankind's universal subconscious desire to usurp their father and claim dominance or whatever. And understanding this structure gives us power because now we can play with it. Rather than becoming the answer for how myths are structured, Campbell's analysis can become a potential answer in a sea of answers. Isn't it more fun that way?